Now, this Golden Jubilee anniversary of the African Union has taken us to a point where we'll see the evolving phases of Africa from the points of decolonization, democratization, and now development. How would you say Africa has fared in the past 50 years till now?
We are looking, and you put it right, about the reflection here regarding the 50 years of the OAU. And it has well been, as you also summarized, a journey from decolonization through the period of self-reliance and on to the quest for development. But Africa's journey of the last 50 years, if one will look at it carefully, at the founding of the OAU in 1963, a good number of African countries had not attained independence at the time. That is why only 32 signatures were appended to the Charter of the OAU on May 25th, 1963, for which we are now marking the Golden Jubilee. And at that time, out of the 32, in fact, Nigeria had 2 signatures, that of Zik and Tafawa Balewa as Prime Minister. Sylvanus Olympio of Togo did not sign because the coup had just taken place. And from that time, there was a reaction against coups in Africa. So naturally, the quest for independence was foremost on the minds of the founding fathers of the OAU. But beyond that, it was the aspiration of our leaders then to move to economic development. In his famous speech, which Kwame Nkrumah gave on the 24th of May 1963, he warned that unless Africa attained unity, Africa would perish. And how right Nkrumah was when he made that statement. But soon after independence, our leaders run into heavy storms, by which they discovered that the promise of freedom, the promise of independence, did not come with prosperity for the people, either because the resources to develop and undertake bold projects were lacking, or the imagination itself wasn't quite there. And in the 70s, if you remember, the Cold War was raging. And where did it rage the most? In Africa, where the superpowers came in, each wanting a share of its influence. And so the Russians under the Soviet Union, the Americans leading the West, tried to get Africa to toe a particular path. And that again interfered with the continent's journey, resulting, in some cases, very violent crises, conflicts around the continent. We had our own little dose. I'm not saying here that the civil war in Nigeria was brought about by the Cold War, but it was a victim of that struggle as well, because Biafrans got support, so did the federal government. And coming then to 1994, the last year that an African country was liberated from colonial rule, it was South Africa that put an end to the era of apartheid minority rule. And then, by that year, the OAU had 52 members. When South Africa became liberated, it became the 53rd member. And that was the equation, of course, that remained until 2002, when the OAU also the AU came into being, even though the transformation and the agreement was reached in 1999. So Africa's journey, as you put it, is one that today you look back and say the struggle for independence has been won, but the quest for economic development is an enduring quest.
Now, looking at the Agenda 2063, Is there the political will?
Why 2063? 2063 is a framework. As you want to build a house, you get an architect you discuss the idea with an architect, look at the concept, and then it is designed for you. But that's just the preliminary phase of it. By looking towards 2063, Africa is trying here to set for itself a goal that is forward-looking.
Now, let's look at Nigeria's engagement at a continental level. And it seems the news of Nigeria's endorsement by the AU for the seat of the UN Security Council's non-permanent seat seems to have come with a lot of cheering notes. But when we look at the reality that lies beyond this feat, one might want to ask, is Nigeria not conceding too much by having to pay the price of losing some seats within the continental level? Isn't this disconnecting Nigeria's engagement in Africa by just winning the United Nations non-permanent Security Council seats?
As far as I know, what we have just achieved, only one other country in recent times has returned to the Security Council after sitting out of that council for only 2 years. The reason being, by its own charter, elected members of the council are not eligible for immediate return to the council. You must sit, as we did, 2 years out of the council before you can go back in. So for Nigeria to have left the council in 2011 and is looking good to go back in 2014, this is a record. But the question of whether we are paying too much, I wouldn't say we are paying too much, because it is not that you are paying. To start with, the seat that Nigeria will be occupying has been zoned to West Africa. It is an ECOWAS seat. So a non-ECOWAS country will not take that seat. So if you ask me, the main competition and the main hurdle will be the endorsement of your sub-region, which is ECOWAS. Nigeria got that in February. And only yesterday, the AU at the level of the Executive Council gave its blessing, being that ECOWAS had already endorsed Nigeria. From here, the journey takes us to New York in October, when the General Assembly will elect the new members. But once Nigeria has been endorsed by ECOWAS and Africa, the hurdle to overcome is to secure a two-thirds majority, which will work out, I think, up to 120 votes. In 2009, when we contested, we got the highest number of votes of the elected countries that year. And also at that time, it was a record because no African country had secured that level of endorsement. We got 186 votes for Nigeria out of 192, which was 6 short.
A landslide.
Well, you put it a landslide. Two votes, in fact, were wasted votes, and they came from West Africa, meaning if they had voted for Nigeria, it would have been 188 out of 192, with 2 countries that were not represented in the hall during the election. So, can we get the 128 minimum required? I can look at you in the face and say, yes, we can. Will it be higher than that? I believe so. So, we hope that we will do what is needful to get a high level of endorsement, which will be an expression of confidence in our ability, an expression of endorsement, in fact, of our past record. Because when we worked on the council 2010, 2011, we left an impressive record. Our leadership was recognized, especially on issues of Africa, and in particular, the issues of West Africa. That was the period we had Côte d'Ivoire. It was the same period that we had Libya. And the role we played on the continent and out of the continent on these two issues, I believe the verdict of history says Nigeria is the leader.
When we look at the growing interest of smaller African countries, this power play, would you call it a distraction or a snag on Nigeria's foreign policy initiative? Countries like when we look at the kind of politics countries like Senegal is playing, even within the West African sub-region, and also countries like Gambia.
Competition is not necessarily the issue of power play, no. Competition is a sign that people have an interest. And a sovereign country is free to pursue whatever it wants. But how do you go about it, I think is the question. And both countries that you have mentioned happen to be what? West African countries, members of ECOWAS. I will not be immodest if I use the term big brother, because that is the term that is used to describe Nigeria in West Africa. And so, who are these that refer to Nigeria as big brother? They come mostly from West Africa, because they are our immediate neighbors. But if you say there is a clash of interest somewhere that then results in competition, I'll agree with you. Is it power play? No. There have been instances where, and you can understand why, if, for instance, there is a post at the international level or even on the continent, take the most recent example of the election of commissioners to the AU Commission. Nigeria had a candidate for political affairs, Ghana had a candidate, and I think another country wanted to come out for the same position. It speaks to the quality of your diplomacy if you are able to reach out to your opponent and convince them to withdraw for you. Why? You sit, and here again, African solutions to African problems will apply. You explain to your competitor that this is what you are taken to the post. They too put on the table. But once you resolve, then you reach an understanding. And so Gambia, I don't know what you're referring to, Senegal, I also cannot say, but it's not unlikely that there may be elections to be had, and so they too have expressed a desire. In the end, it is how well you consult, how well you negotiate, and how well you can convince that will determine who gets what. And it's a common thing, not just between Nigeria, Senegal, and Gambia, but across the continent and across the world, this takes place. So please, I will state very clearly that it is not a case of power play. Power in what regard? Because there are different parameters to measure power. And because we are not talking of any particular parameter here, I will not go into that semantic of saying there is power play between these countries.
Before we end this interview now, one could say, looking at the vision of conflict in Africa and the theme Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance, these two factors have fallen on very contrasting grounds. How do you see the future of Africa within the next 50 years?
Pan-Africanism, as you know, was a rallying philosophy that brought not only Africans, but people of African descent. And the movement, in fact, did not begin in Africa. If you trace its roots, it was in the West Indies and in Europe. The first Pan-African Congress took place in Manchester. But at that time, Africans were oppressed, Africans were discriminated, so the search for identity was foremost in the minds of the leaders of the Pan-African movement at the time. And that helped to shape the struggle against colonial rule. And in the early part of our discussion, I acknowledged that that struggle was won. Why Renaissance? Renaissance because we want to be reborn. We want to be transformed. And here, if we combine Pan-Africanism with Renaissance, we are saying in essence that Africa of the past can be reborn.
It's been a wonderful moment. And having you in this edition of Network Africa, what a wonderful moment indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.